Welcome back, dear listener, to another soft-spoken stroll through the shadows of the past. Whether the night is just beginning for you or you're listening as sleep slowly arrives, I'm happy you've chosen to spend this time here with me. Let me know in the comments. Are you listening from somewhere far and quiet, or in the heart of a busy city winding down? And if these calming explorations bring a sense of rest, please consider subscribing. There are countless more voices from the past still waiting to be heard. This isn't just another tale of Roman decadence. This is the story of a woman who wielded influence over the most powerful man on earth, who challenged every social boundary of her time, and whose downfall would echo through history as one of the most dramatic political scandals ever recorded. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not just who Messalina was, but how her choices rippled through the empire, ultimately sealing her fate in ways that still captivate historians today. But before we unravel this web of passion and politics, let me share something that might surprise you. Modern historians have spent decades trying to separate fact from fiction in Messalina's story because the accounts we have were written by men who lived in a society that both feared and despised powerful women. What we're about to explore isn't just Messalina's story. It's a window into how history itself can become a battleground between truth and propaganda. I'm going to take you through 5 pivotal moments that defined Messalina's rise and fall, each more shocking than the last. We will explore her calculated ascent to power, her scandalous public behavior that horrified Roman society, her political maneuvering that threatened senators and freedmen alike, her ultimate act of defiance that crossed every line, and finally the brutal retribution that ended her life at just 20 years old. Picture Rome in the year 38 CE. The mad emperor Caligula has just been assassinated. And in the chaos that follows, an unlikely figure emerges as the new ruler. Claudius, the stammering, limping scholar, whom everyone had dismissed as unfit for power, suddenly finds himself emperor of the known world. He's 50 years old, unmarried since his divorce, and desperately in need of legitimacy. Enter Messalina, barely 16, beautiful beyond measure, and possessing something Claudius desperately needs, the right bloodline. Valeria Messalina wasn't just any young Roman woman. Her family tree read like a who's who of imperial power. Her great-grandmother was Octavia, sister of Augustus himself. Her mother descended from Mark Antony. In her veins flowed the blood of Rome's founding dynasty, making her more blue-blooded than many emperors. When Claudius married her, he wasn't just taking a wife. He was cementing his claim to the throne through her ancestry. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Messalina understood her value from the very beginning. While Roman wives were expected to be silent, supportive figures who managed households and bore children, Messalina had different plans. She recognized that her bloodline gave her leverage, and she intended to use every drop of it. Within a year of their marriage, she gave birth to Britannicus, Claudius's first legitimate male heir. Suddenly, she wasn't just the emperor's wife, she was the mother of Rome's future ruler. This elevated her status exponentially, but it also painted a target on her back. In the deadly game of Roman politics, being close to power meant being close to danger, and Messalina was about to discover just how treacherous that proximity could be. The early years of her marriage revealed a woman of extraordinary cunning. While Claudius struggled with the complexities of ruling an empire, dealing with rebellious provinces, managing the Senate, and overseeing massive public works projects, Messalina began building her own power base. She cultivated relationships with influential freedmen who had the emperor's ear. She positioned herself as a patron to ambitious young nobles. Most importantly, she learned to read Claudius's weaknesses and exploit them. Claudius, despite his intelligence, was remarkably naive about human nature. His academic mind could grasp complex legal principles and historical precedents, but he often missed the subtle machinations happening right under his nose. Messalina quickly realized that her husband's trust could be weaponized. When she whispered warnings about potential threats to his reign, he listened. When she suggested appointments or removals of officials, he often complied. Without realizing it, Claudius was allowing his young wife to accumulate unprecedented influence over imperial affairs. But power, especially power gained through manipulation, comes with its own intoxicating effects. As Messalina's influence grew, so did her appetite for more. The quiet behind the scenes maneuvering that had marked her early years as Empress began to give way to increasingly bold and public displays of her authority. She started appearing at gladiatorial games with an entourage that rivaled the emperor's own. She began receiving petitions from citizens seeking imperial favor. Most shocking of all, she started making decisions that affected the lives and deaths of Rome's elite. The transformation wasn't lost on Roman society. Whispers began circulating through the city's taverns, bathhouses, and marketplaces. The Empress was overstepping her bounds. She was forgetting her place. She was becoming dangerous. But these whispers, rather than intimidating Messalina, seemed to energize her. She had tasted real power, and she wanted more. This hunger would manifest in ways that scandalized even jaded Roman society. Messalina began hosting elaborate parties at the imperial palace, gatherings that pushed every boundary of acceptable behavior. These weren't merely social events. They were displays of her influence carefully orchestrated to show Rome's elite exactly who held real power in the empire. Senators who had once looked down on her as a mere girl now found themselves competing for invitations to her gatherings, knowing that her favor could make or break their careers. The parties themselves became legendary for their excess. Ancient sources described feasts that lasted for days, entertainment that shocked even Romans accustomed to spectacle, and guest lists that included everyone from senators and generals to actors and gladiators. This mixing of social classes was itself revolutionary in a society built on rigid hierarchies. But Messalina seemed to delight in breaking these ancient taboos. More troubling still were the reports of what happened at these gatherings. Messalina allegedly used these occasions to gather intelligence on potential rivals, to negotiate political alliances, and to identify threats to her position. What appeared to be mere hedonistic revelry was actually a sophisticated information-gathering operation, with the Empress at its center, cataloging the weaknesses, desires, and secrets of Rome's most powerful figures. But perhaps most dangerous of all was how these events affected Messalina herself. Each successful manipulation, each display of her influence, each moment of wielding power over men who should have been her superiors fed a growing sense of invincibility. She began to believe that she was untouchable, that her combination of imperial blood, political cunning, and sexual charisma made her immune to the consequences that destroyed lesser mortals. This growing confidence would lead her to take risks that more cautious individuals would never have contemplated. She began to openly challenge traditional Roman values, not just in private settings, but in public forums where her behavior would be witnessed and reported throughout the empire. She started making appearances at the theater, the circus, and even the gladiatorial schools, often without Claudius, surrounded by her own coterie of supporters and admirers. These public appearances weren't merely social outings. They were political statements. Every time Messalina appeared in public without the emperor, every time she received the adulation of crowds, every time she made decisions that affected public policy, she was asserting her right to wield imperial power independently. In a society where women's power was supposed to flow through their male relatives, Messalina was claiming authority in her own right. The implications of this behavior rippled throughout Roman society. If the empress could ignore traditional boundaries, what did that mean for other Roman women? If she could wield power independently of her husband, was she setting a precedent that threatened the entire patriarchal structure of Roman civilization? These questions weren't merely academic. They struck at the heart of Roman identity and social order. But Messalina's most audacious moves were yet to come. As her confidence grew, so did her willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened her position or questioned her authority. What started as political maneuvering would soon escalate into something far more sinister, setting the stage for a series of events that would shock even the blood-soaked annals of Roman history. The transformation from ambitious young empress to something approaching a reign of terror didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process marked by increasingly bold moves that tested the boundaries of what even an emperor's wife could get away with. Each successful gambit emboldened her for the next, creating a dangerous cycle of escalation that would ultimately prove impossible to control. As we prepare to delve deeper into this extraordinary story, remember that we're not just exploring the life of one remarkable woman. We're examining the nature of power itself, how it corrupts, how it intoxicates, and how it ultimately destroys those who wield it without wisdom or restraint. Messalina's story is a mirror held up to every age, reflecting timeless truths about ambition, desire, and the deadly consequences of believing that rules don't apply to us. Now comes the blood. Because once Messalina had tasted the intoxicating rush of bending Rome's most powerful men to her will, once she had proven that her beauty and bloodline could open any door, close any mouth, or seal any fate, the logical next step wasn't restraint. It was elimination. The first to fall was Marcus Vinicius, a senator whose only crime was possessing something Messalina wanted. His wife. Not his wife's affection, mind you, but her social position, her connections, her usefulness in Messalina's growing web of influence. When Vinicius proved resistant to Messalina's subtle suggestions that he divorce his spouse for the good of the empire, he found himself accused of treason. The evidence was thin, manufactured, almost laughably transparent to anyone who cared to look closely. But who was going to challenge the empress? Who was going to risk their own neck by questioning her judgment? Claudius signed the death warrant without hesitation. His trust in his young wife had become absolute, dangerous in its completeness. When Messalina whispered that Vinicius posed a threat to their son, Britannicus, when she painted pictures of conspiracy and rebellion, the emperor saw only a loving mother protecting their family's future. The reality that his wife was systematically removing anyone who might limit her power never crossed his scholarly mind. Vinicius died quietly, efficiently as enemies of the state were meant to die. His widow, suddenly available and grateful for Messalina's protection, became a valuable addition to the empress's inner circle. The message to Rome's elite was unmistakable. Cooperation would be rewarded. Resistance would be eliminated. But here's what made Messalina truly terrifying. She didn't stop at political enemies. She began targeting anyone who possessed something she coveted. Anyone who had slighted her. Anyone whose very existence reminded her that she wasn't yet untouchable. Asiaticus, one of Rome's wealthiest men, owned gardens that Messalina admired. His reluctance to sell them to her at the price she offered sealed his fate. Accusations of corruption followed, then a trial, then execution. The gardens became part of the imperial estate. Julia Livilla, Caligula's sister, and a woman whose imperial bloodline rivaled Messalina's own, represented a different kind of threat. She was beautiful, intelligent, and possessed the kind of natural gravitas that drew supporters without effort. Worse, she was unmarried, making her a potential bride for any ambitious general or senator looking to legitimize their own claims to power. Messalina couldn't allow such a wild card to remain in play. The destruction of Julia Livilla showcased Messalina's evolving sophistication in the art of character assassination. Rather than crude accusations of treason, she orchestrated a more subtle campaign. Rumors began circulating about Julia's private life, her alleged affairs, her supposed plots against the emperor. These whispers, carefully planted and nurtured by Messalina's network of informants, gradually poisoned Claudius against his own niece. When the final accusations came, adultery with the philosopher Seneca, conspiracy against the throne, they seemed almost inevitable. Julia Livilla was exiled to a remote island where she died under mysterious circumstances, officially from illness, though everyone understood the truth. Seneca himself narrowly escaped execution, saved only by Messalina's calculation that his death might create a martyr. Instead, he was exiled, neutralized, but alive, a living reminder of what happened to those who crossed the Empress. With each successful elimination, Messalina's methods grew more refined, more devastating. She learned to use Rome's own institutions against her enemies. The courts, the Senate, the very legal system that was supposed to protect Roman citizens, became weapons in her arsenal. She discovered that the right accusation delivered at the right moment to the right audience could destroy anyone regardless of their wealth, connections, or innocence. More chilling still was how she began to enjoy the process. Ancient sources describe her attending the trials of her victims, watching from the imperial box, as men she had marked for death pleaded for their lives. She would study their faces, their gestures, their final moments of hope, before the inevitable verdict. This wasn't just political calculation anymore. It had become a form of entertainment, a way of asserting her dominance over life and death itself. The psychological transformation was complete. The ambitious girl, who had married Claudius for security and status, had evolved into something Rome had never seen before. A woman who wielded imperial power, not through influence or manipulation but through fear. Senators began to watch their words around her. Wealthy citizens started making discreet gifts to curry her favor. Even the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the imperial family, began to treat her with the wary respect usually reserved for the emperor himself. But power built on terror has its own unstable foundation. Each execution, each exile, each demonstration of her reach created new enemies, even as it silenced existing ones. The families of her victims didn't forget. The friends of the dead didn't forgive. Most dangerous of all, the very institutions she was using to eliminate her enemies were beginning to understand how thoroughly they had been compromised. Narcissus, Claudius's most trusted freedman and secretary, was the first to recognize the true scope of what was happening. As the man responsible for managing the emperor's correspondence and appointments, he could see patterns that others missed. The steady stream of accusations flowing through Messalina's network. The convenient timing of deaths and exiles. The systematic removal of anyone who might pose even a theoretical threat to the Empress's growing power. Narcissus faced an impossible choice. Confronting Messalina directly would be suicide. She had already demonstrated her ability to destroy far more powerful enemies. But allowing her to continue unchecked threatened not just individual lives, but the stability of the empire itself. If the emperor's wife could eliminate senators and nobles at will, if she could manipulate the legal system with impunity, if she could rule through terror while Claudius remained oblivious, then Rome itself was in mortal danger. The solution, when it came to him, was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than attack Messalina directly, he would document everything, every suspicious death, every convenient exile, every pattern of behavior that suggested conspiracy rather than coincidence. He began building a case, not for immediate use, but for the moment when it might be needed. Because Narcissus understood something that Messalina, intoxicated by her apparent invincibility, had forgotten. In Rome, no one stayed on top forever. Meanwhile, the Empress continued her deadly games. Unaware that her most dangerous enemy wasn't a rival woman or a jealous senator, but a quiet freedman who understood the power of information. She had grown so confident in her ability to eliminate threats that she had stopped looking for them in unexpected places. This blindness to gathering danger would prove to be her first critical mistake. But even as Narcissus quietly gathered evidence, Messalina was preparing for her most audacious move yet. Having conquered the world of Roman politics through fear and manipulation, having bent senators and nobles to her will, having turned the imperial court into her personal kingdom, she was ready to claim something that no Roman woman had ever dared to pursue: actual political office, real governmental power exercised in her own name, rather than through her husband. The precedent she was contemplating would have shocked Augustus himself. Roman women, no matter how noble their birth or how vast their wealth, were forbidden from holding magistracies, commanding armies, or exercising formal political authority. They could influence policy through their male relatives, but they could never rule directly. Messalina was about to challenge this fundamental law of Roman civilization. Her target was the consulship itself, the highest elected office in the Roman state. True, the consulship under the empire was largely ceremonial, with real power concentrated in the emperor's hands, but it retained enormous symbolic importance. The consuls were the heirs of the men who had founded the Republic, the successors to Brutus, and the other heroes who had expelled the last king. For a woman to claim such an office would be revolutionary, unprecedented, and utterly unthinkable to traditional Roman minds. Yet, Messalina began to lay the groundwork with characteristic cunning. She started by suggesting that certain consulships should be reserved for members of the imperial family, ostensibly, to honor their service to the state. She proposed that the emperor's relatives should be given precedence in elections, ensuring that only the most loyal candidates could hold high office. These suggestions, presented as reforms to strengthen imperial authority, actually served to normalize the idea that birth and family connection rather than merit or popular support should determine who held power. The next step was more subtle still. She began appearing at Senate meetings, initially just as an observer, sitting in the section reserved for imperial family members. Her presence was unusual, but not unprecedented. Other empresses had occasionally attended important sessions, but gradually her role evolved. She started whispering suggestions to senators during debates. She began nodding approval or showing displeasure at particular proposals. Most significantly, she started making it clear which candidates she supported for various offices. These interventions had immediate effects. Senators who had ignored her preferences found themselves facing unexpected legal challenges. Candidates who courted her favor discovered that their campaigns ran more smoothly. Their opponents withdrew more readily. Their victories came more easily. Without any formal authority, Messalina was effectively controlling Roman elections through a combination of rewards and punishments. But informal influence, no matter how extensive, wasn't enough anymore. She wanted recognition, official acknowledgement of the power she already wielded. She wanted her name on laws, her image on coins, her authority codified in Roman legal tradition. She wanted to stop ruling from the shadows and step into the blazing light of acknowledged supremacy. This ambition would lead her into territory so dangerous, so unprecedented, so shocking to Roman sensibilities that even her most loyal supporters would begin to question their allegiance. Because what Messalina was contemplating wasn't just political advancement. It was a complete overthrow of the social order that had defined Roman civilization for centuries. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just Messalina's fate, but the future of imperial Rome itself. The moment arrived when patience became impossible for Messalina. Her hunger for recognition had grown beyond whispered influence and shadow manipulation. She craved something that would cement her name in Roman law, Roman tradition, Roman memory forever. The consulship beckoned like a glittering prize, but even that seemed insufficient for someone who had already tasted the intoxicating rush of absolute power over life and death. What she devised next would have been unthinkable to any previous generation of Romans. If she couldn't claim formal political office immediately, she would create her own sphere of authority, her own court within the court, her own government operating parallel to her husband's. She began holding what she called consultations in her private quarters, inviting senators, governors, and military commanders to seek her counsel on matters of state. These weren't casual conversations between an interested wife and her husband's subordinates. These were formal audiences, complete with ceremonial protocols that Messalina invented herself. Visitors were required to request appointments through her personal secretary. They waited in antechambers, decorated with her portrait alongside images of the gods. When finally admitted to her presence, they found themselves facing a woman seated on a throne-like chair, surrounded by scribes recording every word, flanked by guards who answered to her alone. The genius of this arrangement was its apparent informality. Technically, Messalina was simply offering advice, as any concerned member of the imperial family might do. She wasn't issuing orders or making official pronouncements. She was merely sharing her thoughts with men who happened to value her wisdom. But the reality was far different. Those who ignored her suggestions found themselves facing investigations, their careers stalling, their families subjected to uncomfortable scrutiny. Those who implemented her recommendations discovered opportunities opening before them, promotions materializing, obstacles mysteriously vanishing. Within months, half of Rome's governing class was effectively reporting to Messalina before they reported to Claudius. Provincial governors would send duplicate dispatches, one to the emperor and another to his wife. Military commanders would seek her approval before implementing new strategies. Even foreign ambassadors began requesting audiences with the Empress, recognizing that her favor might prove more valuable than official diplomatic protocols. The transformation was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Rome had never seen anything like it. Even during the Republic, when powerful women like Fulvia or Livia wielded enormous influence, they had operated through male intermediaries, maintaining at least the fiction that authority flowed through proper channels. Messalina had abandoned such pretenses entirely. She was ruling openly, boldly, with a confidence that suggested she believed herself untouchable. But perhaps most remarkably, she was succeeding. The empire didn't collapse under this unprecedented arrangement. Trade continued. Taxes were collected. Borders remained secure. Public works progressed on schedule. If anything, some aspects of governance improved under her dual administration. Messalina possessed an intuitive understanding of human motivation that complemented Claudius's scholarly approach to policy. Where he might spend weeks researching historical precedents for a decision, she could cut through complexity with ruthless pragmatism. Her success, however, created new dangers. Every effective decision she made, every crisis she resolved, every problem she solved more efficiently than traditional channels might have managed, served as evidence that a woman could govern as well as any man. This was revolutionary thinking in a society built on the assumption of male superiority in all matters of public importance. Conservative senators began to whisper among themselves about the dangerous precedent being set. If Claudius's wife could effectively co-rule the empire, what did that mean for their own wives, daughters and sisters. Were they witnessing the beginning of a new age where women might claim political equality? Or were they seeing an aberration that needed to be corrected before it spread? These concerns might have remained mere grumbling if Messalina had been content to exercise power quietly, efficiently, without drawing unnecessary attention to herself. But contentment had never been part of her nature. Having proven that she could govern effectively, she now wanted recognition for her achievements. She wanted historians to record her contributions. She wanted poets to celebrate her wisdom. She wanted temples erected in her honor, not just as the emperor's wife or the mother of his heir, but as a ruler in her own right. This desire for recognition led her to commission a series of public monuments that would commemorate her role in various imperial achievements. The completion of the Claudian aqueduct, one of Rome's greatest engineering marvels, was marked by inscriptions that mentioned her contributions alongside those of the emperor. New roads built during Claudius's reign bore markers acknowledging her involvement in their planning. Even military victories were celebrated with monuments that credited her strategic insights. To Roman eyes, accustomed to seeing women's names appear in public only as wives, mothers, or daughters of important men, these inscriptions were shocking. Here was a woman claiming credit for achievements typically attributed solely to male rulers. Here was someone asserting that her contributions to the empire deserved permanent recognition, that future generations should remember her not just as Claudius's wife, but as a partner in governance. The psychological effect on Messalina herself was intoxicating. Seeing her name carved in marble, reading poetry that praised her wisdom, hearing crowds cheer when she appeared at public ceremonies, all of this fed a growing sense that she had transcended the normal limitations of her gender and her time. She began to believe that she was creating a new model of female leadership that would inspire women for generations to come. But inspiration can be dangerous when it challenges fundamental social structures. Reports began reaching Rome from the provinces of women, citing Messalina's example to claim greater authority in their own communities. Wives of governors started attending official meetings. Daughters of wealthy merchants began demanding roles in family businesses previously reserved for men. Even among the common people, women started questioning traditional limitations on their activities and ambitions. This social upheaval terrified Rome's male elite more than any military threat or economic crisis. They could understand and respond to conventional challenges, rebellious provinces, barbarian invasions, natural disasters, but a challenge to the basic assumptions about gender roles and social hierarchy struck at the very foundation of their worldview. If women could rule as effectively as men, if traditional limitations were revealed as arbitrary conventions rather than natural law, then what other assumptions might prove equally fragile? The backlash, when it came, would be swift and merciless. But Messalina, intoxicated by her apparent success, blinded by the adulation of her supporters, drunk on the unprecedented power she wielded, failed to recognize the growing storm. She had become so accustomed to bending others to her will that she had forgotten a crucial truth about power. It always creates enemies, and those enemies never stop looking for opportunities to strike back. Narcissus, still quietly documenting every excess, every overreach, every dangerous precedent, watched the Empress's growing boldness with calculating patience. He understood that Messalina's very success was creating the conditions for her destruction. Each public monument, each inscription bearing her name, each assertion of authority beyond traditional bounds, was providing ammunition for her eventual downfall. The freedman had learned something that Messalina, for all her cunning, had never grasped. In Rome, visibility was vulnerability. The shadows that she had abandoned in her quest for recognition had also provided protection. By stepping into the blazing light of public acknowledgement, she had made herself a target for every enemy, every rival, every traditionalist who yearned for a return to familiar hierarchies. But Messalina's most dangerous enemy wasn't among the senators whispering in dark corners or the conservatives plotting her downfall. It was her own insatiable appetite for more. Having achieved the impossible, effective rule of the Roman Empire, she couldn't resist pushing further, reaching for prizes that would prove beyond even her remarkable abilities to claim safely. The consulship still beckoned, that ultimate symbol of Roman political achievement. Military command called to her, the chance to lead legions in her own name rather than through intermediaries. Even more intoxicating was the possibility of religious authority, of claiming the kind of divine sanction that might make her position truly unassailable. Each of these ambitions represented not just personal advancement, but a fundamental challenge to Roman civilization itself. The consulship had never been held by a woman in 800 years of Roman history. Military command was considered inherently masculine, requiring physical courage and tactical skills that society deemed beyond female capabilities. Religious authority for women was limited to specific cults and ceremonies, never extending to the broad spiritual leadership that emperors claimed. Yet, Messalina began to believe that her unprecedented success in governance qualified her for these ultimate prizes. She had already shattered so many barriers, violated so many traditions, achieved so many impossibilities that the remaining limitations seemed arbitrary, temporary obstacles rather than fundamental principles of Roman life. This growing confidence would lead her to contemplate moves so audacious, so shocking, so completely beyond the bounds of acceptable behavior that even her most loyal supporters would be forced to choose between their devotion to her and their commitment to Rome itself. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of imperial power, challenge the foundations of Roman society, and ultimately determine whether one woman's extraordinary ambitions could reshape an entire civilization. The Empress, who had begun as a teenage bride seeking security, had evolved into something Rome had never seen before. A woman who believed herself capable of claiming any prize, breaking any rule, violating any tradition in pursuit of absolute power. The question that remained was whether Rome itself could survive such unprecedented ambition, or whether the collision between Messalina's desires and Roman tradition would destroy them both. As winter settled over the Eternal City, as senators huddled in their villas discussing the impossible situation that had developed, as Narcissus continued his patient documentation of imperial excess, the empire held its breath. Everyone could sense that something unprecedented was building, that the careful balance between tradition and innovation that had sustained Roman civilization for centuries was about to be tested in ways no one could fully predict. What came next would shock even those who thought they understood the depths of Messalina's ambition, because the Empress, who had already achieved the impossible, was about to attempt something that would make her previous achievements seem modest by comparison. The moment that would define everything came not through careful planning or political calculation, but through a single glance across a crowded amphitheater. Gaius Silius, the most handsome man in Rome, caught Messalina's eye during the gladiatorial games celebrating Claudius's triumph in Britain. He was everything the emperor wasn't. Young, athletic, devastatingly beautiful, with a kind of magnetic presence that made crowds turn to stare when he entered a room. But Silius represented far more than mere physical attraction. He was a senator from an ancient patrician family, a man whose bloodline stretched back to the earliest days of the Republic. His grandfather had been a consul, his father a respected general who had died fighting Germanic tribes. In choosing him, Messalina wasn't just selecting a lover. She was claiming the very essence of Roman nobility for herself. The seduction began immediately. Within days of that first meeting, Silius found himself receiving invitations to private dinners at the palace. Messalina deployed every weapon in her considerable arsenal: her beauty, her wit, her power, her promises of advancement. She spoke to him of poetry and philosophy, subjects that revealed an intelligence far beyond what most men expected from even an educated woman. She listened to his political opinions with the kind of focused attention that made him feel like the most important person in the empire. Most intoxicating of all, she shared with him glimpses of the real power she wielded. She showed him correspondence from provincial governors seeking her guidance. She let him witness her private audiences with senators and military commanders. She made him understand that he wasn't just courting the emperor's wife. He was being invited into partnership with the most influential woman in the known world. Silius, despite his noble birth and political experience, was completely unprepared for this level of seduction. Roman women of his acquaintance were either dutiful wives, focused on household management, or courtesans skilled in physical pleasure, but lacking in political sophistication. Messalina represented something entirely new, a woman who combined devastating sensuality with genuine intellectual engagement and unprecedented political power. Within weeks, he was utterly captivated. Their affair began in the shadows, conducted through carefully orchestrated meetings in private villas, secret rendezvous in gardens owned by Messalina's supporters, stolen moments during public ceremonies where they could exchange meaningful glances while maintaining the facade of casual acquaintance. But secrecy had never satisfied Messalina for long. Having proven that she could seduce Rome's most eligible bachelor, having demonstrated once again her irresistible appeal, she wanted more. She wanted recognition, acknowledgement, the kind of open relationship that would force Roman society to accept her choices regardless of their shock or disapproval. The first sign of her changing attitude came during the Saturnalia festival, Rome's annual celebration of social inversion, where normal rules were temporarily suspended. Messalina appeared at the public festivities with Silius at her side, not as a discreet escort, but as an obvious companion. They shared wine from the same cup, laughed at each other's jokes, exchanged touches that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The reaction was immediate and electric. Romans who had grown accustomed to their empress's unconventional behavior found themselves confronted with something that crossed entirely new lines. Adultery among the elite was common enough, but it was conducted discreetly, with at least a pretense of maintaining proper appearances. Open adultery, flaunted publicly by the emperor's wife, was unprecedented and deeply shocking. But the public display served Messalina's purposes perfectly. By forcing Roman society to confront her relationship with Silius, she was testing their willingness to accept her choices simply because of who she was. Would they condemn her, risking her wrath and potential retaliation, or would they find ways to rationalize her behavior, proving once again that her power transcended normal social boundaries? The answer revealed the true extent of her influence. While private conversations buzzed with scandal and outrage, public reaction remained muted. Senators who might have spoken out against any other woman's behavior found themselves calculating the potential consequences of criticizing the empress. Wealthy citizens who were shocked by her conduct nevertheless sent gifts and invitations, hoping to maintain her favor. Even religious leaders who should have condemned such flagrant violation of marriage vows remained diplomatically silent. This acquiescence intoxicated Messalina beyond measure. She had openly violated one of Roman society's most fundamental taboos and faced no meaningful consequences. If she could conduct a public affair with impunity, what other boundaries might prove equally fragile? what other rules might bend before the reality of her power? The relationship with Silius deepened rapidly under these circumstances. No longer confined to stolen moments in secret meetings, they began spending entire days together. Messalina would appear at Senate meetings with Silius in her entourage. They attended theater performances sitting side by side in the imperial box. They were seen together at religious ceremonies, at public banquets, at gladiatorial contests, presenting themselves as an established couple despite the inconvenient fact that she remained married to the emperor. Silius himself was transformed by this unprecedented situation. The shy senator, who had initially been overwhelmed by Messalina's attention, evolved into something approaching a co-ruler in his own right. He began offering opinions on imperial policy, making recommendations for appointments, even issuing what amounted to orders to lower-ranking officials who sought to curry favor with the Empress's obvious favorite. The psychological dynamic between them became increasingly complex. Messalina had chosen Silius partially because his beauty and noble birth reflected well on her own status. But she discovered that his genuine intelligence and political instincts made him a valuable partner in governance. For the first time in her life, she had found someone who could match her ambition while complementing her skills. Silius, meanwhile, found himself caught between gratitude for Messalina's favor and growing awareness of his precarious position. He understood that his elevation depended entirely on her continued protection. But he also recognized that association with her exposed him to enormous risks. If her power ever faltered, if Claudius ever recognized the true nature of their relationship, if political circumstances shifted against her, he would likely be the first to pay the price. This tension between opportunity and danger created a strange intimacy between them. They were partners in the most audacious political gamble in Roman history. Co-conspirators in a plot to redefine the very nature of imperial power. Their relationship transcended mere adultery or even romantic love. They had become collaborators in an attempt to reshape civilization itself. But their growing boldness was creating new enemies every day. Conservative senators who had grudgingly accepted Messalina's political influence found her open adultery impossible to stomach. Military commanders who had worked with her effectively began questioning whether they could serve an emperor whose wife so flagrantly dishonored him. Even among the common people, whispers began circulating about the Empress who had forgotten her duties as wife and mother. Most dangerous of all, their behavior was finally penetrating Claudius's scholarly detachment from palace intrigue. The emperor, who had remained oblivious to his wife's political maneuvering, and even her previous affairs, could not ignore the increasingly public nature of her relationship with Silius. Reports reached him from too many sources. Descriptions were too detailed. The evidence was too overwhelming for even his trusting nature to dismiss. Narcissus watched these developments with growing excitement. After years of documenting Messalina's excesses, carefully building a case that might someday prove useful, he suddenly found himself holding evidence of behavior so flagrant, so undeniable, so shocking that even Claudius would be forced to act. The Empress's greatest triumph, her ability to conduct an open affair without consequences, might finally provide the weapon needed to destroy her. But Messalina remained oblivious to the gathering storm. Intoxicated by her apparent immunity from consequences, emboldened by Silius's partnership, convinced that her power had transcended all traditional limitations, she prepared to take the step that would define her legacy forever. Because conducting an open affair, shocking as it was, still fell short of her ultimate ambition. She wanted marriage, not a secret ceremony or a private commitment, but a full Roman wedding complete with all the traditional rituals witnessed by the city's elite celebrated as a public festival. She wanted to marry Silius while remaining married to Claudius, creating an unprecedented situation that would force Roman law and custom to accommodate her desires. The idea was breathtaking in its audacity. Roman marriage was a sacred institution governed by centuries of legal tradition and religious ritual. Bigamy was not merely illegal. It was considered an offense against the gods themselves, a violation of divine law that threatened the entire cosmic order. For the emperor's wife to commit such an act would be revolutionary beyond measure. Yet Messalina began planning exactly such a ceremony. She consulted with priests about the necessary rituals, commissioned artists to design decorations, sent invitations to Rome's most important families. She approached the project with the same methodical precision she had applied to her political machinations, treating the impossibility of her goals as merely another obstacle to overcome through careful planning and ruthless execution. Silius initially resisted the idea, understanding better than Messalina the enormous risks involved. An affair, even a public one, might be overlooked or rationalized by a trusting husband, but a wedding ceremony would be impossible to ignore or explain away. It would force a direct confrontation with Claudius, create a crisis that could only end in triumph or total destruction. But Messalina's powers of persuasion proved irresistible. She painted pictures of the life they could build together, ruling Rome as true partners rather than hiding in shadows. She described the precedent they would set for future generations, showing that love and political compatibility mattered more than outdated customs. Most compelling of all, she argued that their marriage would legitimize their relationship in the eyes of the gods, transforming what critics called adultery into a sacred union blessed by divine authority. Under this relentless campaign, Silius's resistance crumbled. His love for Messalina, combined with his growing